I'm hoping it is now, they're going to the one in the bottom corner, I think is the one to go for. Normally I try and get the laptop a little closer so I can press the buttons, so I make sure the punchlines and the pictures appear at the right moments. However, such is the problem I've been having with PowerPoint today, I'm thinking I won't risk it. I'll just have to give a little special signal to Belinda every time I need her to press the button and hope we can coordinate it carefully enough. Oh, that's not what's meant to be.
Yeah, that can be nice. Give us 2 seconds.
Alright, now, the moment of truth is this PowerPoint presentation finally going to be unleashed upon the audience. Alright, Belinda, are you ready to be aggressively pressing that button?
I am ready.
Alright, now you can see why I was making this PowerPoint presentation in its full glory. And I had to change all my lovely medieval fonts, but I found a substitute font that I feel you would like. So, as I begin the presentation today, you'll note that it's listed on the conference program as an academic paper, in among all the storytellers. However, I like to think that this presentation will actually combine elements of both. And because it is, of course, about a story which I wrote, entitled, Let Down Your Hair. And as the astute among you, or those who've actually read your program, will observe, and guess, by looking at this, it is indeed a modern-day retelling of Rapunzel, written as a coming-of-age novel set in contemporary Australia. Now, not quite as obviously as some of the other presentations we've looked at today, but it is indeed set in contemporary Australia. It just had to be tampered with a little to pass muster as a commercially viable novel. All right, so having actually sort of been put down as an academic paper, I thought to myself, however, this is the Australian Fairy Tale Society Conference. Therefore, I feel if I'm going to be framing my paper, I should therefore do it in an appropriate manner for a paper to be presented at the Australian Fairy Tale Society Conference, which is, of course, as a fairy tale. So, once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved 2 things most of all in the world. The first thing was hair. And the second thing was stories. Just take this out of the way. She loved the many textures and colours that hair had to offer, and she secretly wished to have long golden waterfall of hair, just like all the pretty girls seem to have in stories and TV programmes. Sadly, when her wishes failed to come true, she consoled herself by reading stories and keeping a list of every name she encountered in them, so that she could name the many, many cats and dogs and children she planned to have. On her farm, when she grew up, she planned to have at least 300 dogs and 300 cats and 100 horses and 10 children, making sure she had at least one representative of every hair and fur colour. The stories she loved most of all, however, okay, were the ones that her parents read to her over and over from the Fairy Tale Treasury and the Mother Goose Treasury. She loved these so much that she attempted her first fairy tale retelling before she'd even learned how to write. You'll note the writing is actually done, I think, by my father. Later, she discovered that her handwriting was as shonky and wonky as a 7-legged spider. So, when, aged 6, she decided to write her first novel, her father heaved down his old typewriter so she could start work on her very first masterpiece, which I have actually scanned for you, Snowy and Candy and Chester, the gripping tale of a young girl adopting a wild pony. Not long after, however, something happened that forever changed the direction of her writing. Her primary school teacher read her... Okay. Roald Dahl's Revolting Rhymes. In Roald Dahl's Revolting Rhymes, he takes familiar fairy tales, the ones that she loved so much, and twists and subverts them, turning them into comical rhyming verse. In one, for example, after Little Red Riding Hood says, "But Grandma, what great big eyes you have," she says, Red Riding Hood says, "But Grandma, what a lovely great big furry coat you have on," and proceeds to shoot the wolf and turn him into an actual fur coat. In another, Jack's mum tells him that he stinks and needs to take a bath, so that the giant at the top of the beanstalk can't smell him anymore. And in her personal favourite, Snow White steals the magic mirror so that she can give the gambling-addicted 7 dwarves racing tips. The little girl was inspired. She abandoned her pony story at once and started writing subversive retellings of well-known songs and fairy tales. Retellings where she took the familiar characters, motifs and plots and twisted them in crafty and comical ways. Her first venture was a spin on a nursery rhyme, which she titled Baa Rainbow Sheep. And she did this, I'll have you know, a year or 2 before the gay rights movement adopted it. So I was precocious and ahead of my time. But soon after sort of having begun with the nursery rhymes, a gentle introduction, she moved on to short stories. First into short story form, and this is a story which I called Petrolella, which I wrote when I was 10. And later as her first serious attempt at a novel, which I actually submitted to Penguin. Final round rejection offer, just not bad. Eventually, though, it was inevitable that she would marry her 2 childhood loves, stories and hair, and write a novel-length retelling of Rapunzel. And this is where our true story begins. To write subversive versions of well-known tales, the first thing you need to consider is which tales you want to subvert. After all, after all, if you're aiming for clever reinterpretations and in-jokes, you need to think about who's going to be in on the joke. For people writing in English, there's quite a bit of source material that fits the bill. One of these is the Bible. While practicing Christianity isn't as widespread as it once was, there's certainly still plenty of mileage for creative retellings of Bible stories. There's one. There's 2. And I've chosen movies as an easier sort of pictorial representation. Jane Austen's works have also proved a fruitful ground for authors and filmmakers in the business of creative adaptation. So we see Clueless, which is an adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma. And we see Pride and Prejudice, which is a Bollywood-Hollywood collaboration of Pride and Prejudice. Finally, the other writer whose work is constantly being adapted is the trusty William Shakespeare. A couple of modern-day reinterpretations of that. West Side Story is, of course, an interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. And 10 Things I Hate About You is a modern-day subversion of Taming of the Shrew. However, there are, of course, a selection of stories which are probably better known than almost any other source, except perhaps the Bible, namely fairy tales, and in particular those collected by the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. Thanks to Disney's film adaptation of these, these are well known not only in the English-speaking world, but all over the globe. Now, Disney's adaptations have aimed to be a reasonably faithful, albeit reasonably sanitised version of the originals. However, there have actually been some subversive retellings that have actually been made, and there's been quite a few films in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. This one, which is apparently quite bad, but I had some legal specialists maybe how to tell us about that. We have Snow White and the Huntsman, also I believe not a great success. Rebecca Ann is nodding dubiously. And we have Maleficent, which I went to see with the Fairy Tale Society last year. Now, Let Down Your Hair is of course based on Rapunzel. For my source material, I focused on the version of the 1812 version found in the Brothers Grimm's Children and Household Tales, rather than the somewhat embellished and sanitised version found in the 1857 edition, not being a fan of sanitation, at least not in the story department. So to refresh your memories, this story, the original source, begins with a young couple. Now you'll notice, as a side note, before we go on, these pictures are taken from Walt Disney's recent film, Tangled, in which, as Kate Forsyth, the well-known Rapunzel scholar, observes, has actually changed the sort of ordinary young couple into a royal couple, a king and queen. So, and Rapunzel is a princess who is stolen away and then is returned to her throne at the end. As Kate Forsyth actually observed, this changes Rapunzel from what she calls a rise story, in which an ordinary girl eventually marries a prince and ascends into social status, to a restore story, in which a princess who has fallen from her throne is actually restored to her rightful place in the social pecking order. Now, I don't know that my Let Down Your Hair is either. In fact, it's probably, appropriately enough for this conference, a transformation story, in which her status doesn't particularly change, but she changes a great deal. So it's very much a coming-of-age story in which she finds her own place between the two towers into which I place her. Right, so we have our young couple here. So they finally conceive a child after many, many years of trying very hard. Alright, so the couple's back window overlooks a garden filled with herbs and flowers belonging to a fairy. Now I've actually got a picture there of the original Rapunzel herb. So it looks rather like a weed, but I'm told that it's actually quite tasty to eat in summers. Now you'll notice that it's referred to in the original 1812 tale, with the woman in question, who owns the garden, is referred to as a fairy. Now we notice in this, I'm not sure whether it's a matter of translating the original word, the translation from the original German, or it's a matter of just changing way that fairy is conceived. But fairy, these days, has a slightly twinkly, wispy kind of feel to it. Whereas, really, if you look at the behaviour of the fairy in Rapunzel, you'd probably be more inclined these days to translate whatever the Grimm brothers wrote as witch myself, which is something I've actually done on my own flyers. However, what we have here is Disney's representation of the wicked fairy in Rapunzel. So the pregnant wife sees the lovely fresh Rapunzel growing out there, and she begs and begs her husband to get her some. And he does get her some. He sneaks out into the garden, the evil fairy's garden, and steals her some, but one serve is just not enough. She immediately wants a second helping, so he sneaks into the garden again, and of course is immediately caught by the wicked fairy. Now the fairy, in one of those unequal bargains that so often happen in fairy tales, immediately demands his firstborn child as repayment for the theft. And the couple, despite having tried so long to have a baby, agree that, oh, sure, but salad leaves much more important. And to add insult to abduction, the fairy then names the child after the salad leaves in question and calls her Rapunzel. Now, when Rapunzel turns 12, she becomes the most beautiful child under the sun. And can't have all that beauty around, being all young and virginal and fragile, so the fairy properly locks her up in a tower. Okay, there she is. Which can only be accessed by waiting at the foot and calling Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, and climbing up using her hair. So just when the fairy thought Rapunzel's virtue was secure, trouble arrived. In the form of trouble. In trouble. Okay. So he hears her beautiful singing, sees his beautiful young woman standing singing in the window, and properly falls deeply in love with her. And that's sort of love at first sight thing, which is also common to fairy tales. He sort of comes every night and watches, and eventually he manages to see the fairy who and figures out how to actually get up the tower. So he tries himself, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. And mysteriously not noticing the shift from a female voice to a male voice, she actually throws down her hair immediately and in he climbs. And at first she's terrified and shocked, but she comes to like him quite quickly, one must say. And so he starts visiting her tower just about every day. And there, report the Grimms, they lived in joy and pleasure. Okay, who's the button? Joy and pleasure. And I did actually, in my original PowerPoint, I have the top of the tower rocking. sadly, it didn't work in the transformation here. Joy and pleasure for a long time. You'll note that this joy and pleasure was replaced in the 1857 edition by a quickie wedding, at which both celebrant and witnesses were mysteriously absent. However, the trouble with all that sustained joy and pleasure is that it does have consequences. And in Rapunzel's case, these consequences were dire indeed. She naively wonders to the fairy why her dresses are getting so tight around the middle, and the fairy realises that the fortress she built to preserve Rapunzel's virginity has been penetrated. You godless child, she cries, and she cuts off Rapunzel's hair and casts her into the wilderness, where Rapunzel bears the fruit of her joy and pleasure. Twin babies, one boy and one girl. Meanwhile, the fairy uses the severed hair to lure the poor prince into the tower and tells him what she has done. In despair, he hurls himself from the tower, which obviously can't be that tall because he manages to survive the tower fall, but he loses his sight. In the 1857 edition, this is because a thorn bush breaks his fall and puts out his eyes. So he actually ends up blind, but survives the fall. So, moving on to the next slide. Blind and despairing, he wanders through the forest on the extreme fad diet of eating nothing but grass and roots. Come back, and he comes.
Oh.
And one day, as he wanders, he hears a familiar voice singing where she's living sadly in the wilderness with her twin children. He's been wandering about eating nothing but grass and roots for some years now, so I'm sure he's not in good shape by now. However, when she hears his familiar voice, Rapunzel rushes out to find him, flings herself into his arms, and weeps into him, and her 2 tears magically restore his eyesight. In the 1812 tale, this ends there with the restoration of the prince's vision, but as you would infer, and as the 1857 version spells out, he takes her back to his kingdom, where they live happily ever after. Now, with this version of Rapunzel as my source, I started speculating on how I was going to convert this into a full-length novel. Length, of course, being a key issue, not only in the hair department, but also in terms of storytelling. One really obvious issue is that the reader only gets the barest sketch of the 5 characters. We don't know much about their past, their motivations, or what happens to them after the action of the story has finished. Now, you can get by with this in a 900-word fairy tale, but it really won't fly in an 80,000-word novel. The story raises quite a few questions about the characters that need to be answered if you're going to write a much longer story. For example, Rapunzel's parents. In the original story, after having a fairly inauspicious start of trading their daughter for a handful of salad greens, they vanish a third of the way into the story and are never heard of again. Also, for a couple so desperate to have children, they were very quick indeed to hand over their baby to a dubious foster parent with anger management issues. Now, there's a bit of a glitch here, that's all right. We'll move on to the next person's picture at least. All right, speaking of the woman with anger management issues, why on earth did this angry woman want the baby in the first place? Given the way that she locked the girl up in the tower and threw her out when she was pregnant, it doesn't seem to have come from a deep desire to nurture or anything of that sort. You might infer perhaps, you might perhaps extrapolate from the original version that given her obsession with protecting what appears to be Rapunzel's puberty, perhaps she was hoping to do a little bit of social climbing by marrying her beautiful virgin foster daughter to a wealthy man and thereby gaining social status. It's a theory. It's a theory which becomes a little more plausible when you consider that as soon as Rapunzel is rendered impure, she is very quick to punish and throw out both her and the man who led her astray. Now, while she's clearly an unsavoury sort of character, she's by far the most interesting one in the tale, and it'll be good to find out what happens to her after she exacts her revenge. Okay, let's just move on to Rapunzel, because this is a little odd. Yep. Moving as to Rapunzel herself, the tale implies that she's kind of innocent, but rather impulsive. She's very quick to indulge in joy and pleasure with an illicit intruder, and so naive that she doesn't actually recognise a pretty obvious symptom of pregnancy. Now, this isn't a lot to go by, really. She's very beautiful, she's very innocent, and she's a bit impulsive. So I'd be curious in the novel to explore her character and worldview in more depth. How has she been shaped by her sort of long period of isolation in the tower? Finally, let's think about our prince. Evidently, he's a great fan of music, swayed to great passion by a good singing voice and a pretty face. He's also, if you infer that you have a young girl who's been living in isolation, has barely laid eyes on a man, at least certainly not since she reached puberty at 12 or so, he must be both kind of quite disarming and non-threatening, but also rather charming and seductive, because he's pretty swift to convince this innocent, frightened girl who's barely laid eyes on a man before to marry him fairly rapidly. He does, however, also seem to surpass even Romeo in his capacity for romantic drama. At least Juliet actually appeared to be dead when Romeo committed suicide over her. He jumped out the window of the tower when Rapunzel had only been cast into the wilderness and was still, presumably, alive and well. Nonetheless, you have to admit he must have had a fair bit of grit, not to mention a cast-iron digestive system, as he managed to survive some years, the Grimm brothers say, while wandering blind in a forest eating nothing but grass and roots. Now, the other thing to consider is where to set my Rapunzel retelling. So I had a bit of a look at the settings in the original fairy tale, and there are actually 4 of these. The first is the house overlooking the herb garden. The second is the tower. The third is the wilderness. And the fourth is the kingdom. Now, I needed to muse on how to interpret these 4 different settings in a novel format, especially as I wanted to set my novel in the present day. For example, if you're looking at the present day, the connotations of the word wilderness have rather changed. In 19th century Northern Europe, or presumably before that, when the Grimm brothers went brought in on Percy net and all that sort of stuff, forests were probably considered a pretty dangerous kind of area. Presumably there were still a few wolves around at that time. They were much, much larger then. There might be a place where people semi-regularly did get lost or eaten by wolves or something. These days, however, the word wilderness suggests that perhaps Rapunzel was sent to a nice, cuddly national park where she did a bit of hiking. So it doesn't quite have the same sense of menace it might once have had. Now, as for kingdoms still exist, but these days it's pretty unlikely that any prince could court a commoner without people finding out about it, as we have seen. Finally, if we're looking at the herbs, there's all sorts of interesting ways you could potentially interpret those. I did briefly consider, and might still consider writing as a short story, having a man getting caught while pinching marijuana from his neighbour's crop, for example, or his pregnant girlfriend. But in the end I decided perhaps that I wasn't going to go down that path. Eventually, having looked at the settings carefully, I decided what I wanted to do was look at the key motifs in Rapunzel and find a way of interpreting these in a modern setting. Now the key motifs, some of them are settings and some of them aren't, but as I see it, these are the tower, the herbs, the long golden hair, and the healing tears. Sorry, that's a bit out of order. I wanted to interpret these in a way which was recognisable yet crafty, and place them in a contemporary Australian setting. I also wanted to think about how to handle the aspects of the story that aren't actually technically possible. For example, we have a girl growing 20 feet of golden hair that two adults managed to climb up a tower with without yanking her out the window to an untimely grave. The other thing is that having the girl's tears magically restore the vision of a man who was blinded some years ago when thorns punctured his eyes doesn't seem terribly plausible if you're going to have a realist kind of novel. So I needed to think about how literally I actually wanted to capture these motifs. Whether to incorporate a bit of magical realism, so that I could actually have some literal interpretations of people climbing the hair and so on, or whether I wanted to work them in symbolically. I won't tell you what I decided with the healing tears, but I'll talk about the hair in a few slides' time. Now, as I mulled over these motifs, I concluded that the key to grounding the Rapunzel story in the modern day was finding my tower. Alright, given that I wanted to set the story in contemporary Australia, I started considering options that would work. Now, the first thing I came up with, obviously in modern day Australia, there are plenty of random tall buildings. There are apartment blocks, there are office blocks, there are sort of sundry skyscrapers. But I actually wanted to be a little bit more subversive than that. Putting her into a random tall building just lacked a little bit of subversive pizzazz. So the very first idea that I came up with was making it a horizontal metal tower in the sky. I was actually going to reconstruct Rapunzel as a flight attendant in a horizontal metal tower with a very controlling flight manager obsessed with how her crew managed their hair. However, while I like the subversive nature of this, I actually went as far as interviewing my friend who was working at the now defunct Ansett and getting some material. But I decided the presence of large numbers of passengers in your typical plane kind of detracted from Rapunzel's sense of isolation. I could, of course, make it a figurative sense of metaphorical isolation, which a lot of flight attendants say they feel, but I decided that was an aircraft bridge too far. What I do now is I run training programs for university staff, which I've done in about 18 or 20 universities around Australia, so I've had a lot of first-hand experience of universities and the academics who populate them. So once I had my tower, the rest of the story fell quite easily into place. In a university, the fairy would be, naturally, a formidable professor. So what might induce, now this is actually the VC of Harvard, I believe, the Vice-Chancellor of Harvard or something. Yes. Okay, so what might induce a professor to lock a 12-year-old girl up in the tower? Now, while it's possible the professor, an educated woman, might lock up a girl to protect her virginity, it still seems a bit of a stretch in a modern-day kind of a setting. So I decided, the idea of how to update this protecting her virginity business came to me from someone very young. In fact, about as young as a human being can be. My first pregnancy. So when I had this child in utero, before I had the scan to find out whether it was a boy or a girl, I suddenly found myself thinking, what if this is a daughter? And if it is a daughter, I look around at the society and the media images of women, and I thought to myself with new eyes and thought, what sort of world am I bringing her into here? And I started feeling a little bit worried about the messages she would get from the media about what girls are supposed to be like. For example, they're definitely supposed to be raising babies, not building things. Yes. Yeah. they're definitely the ones that should be doing the housework. They've got to look pretty. And also sexy, but not, they shouldn't engage in too much sexual activity, because too much you become a filthy slag, and not enough you become a prude that no one's going to want. And the more I looked at it, the more alarming the prospect of raising a girl became. That's not it. Alright, so, because the messages from the media about what it's like being a little girl, messages little girls get as they're growing up about what you're going to be like as a woman and what being a woman's like, weren't really to my liking, I have to say. So I thought to myself, if I have a daughter, what am I going to do to protect her from this so that she doesn't get distressed and feel that she needs to behave like a porn star when she finds her first sexual partner, or get so obsessed with trying to sculpt her body to the parameters the media tells her she should have, and so on and so on. What can I do? And I thought, well, obviously I can't protect her from the media. The media is everywhere. These days everyone carries a screen in their pocket. So what can I do? I'm just going to have to empower and make her feel strong so that she can rise above these sorts of things and think for herself without getting too distressed by them. But then I thought again, and I thought, well, I wouldn't bother to try. It would be far too difficult to protect her from them. But what sort of woman might try to actually protect her daughter from all these sort of nasty patriarchal messages as she grew up? And what would it take? I mean, you'd practically, in a day with media being absolutely everywhere, you'd practically have to lock her up away from the world and cut her off from the modern world altogether. And I thought, rather like the fairy in Rapunzel. I thought to myself. Now, what sort of woman would do this? A feminist, obviously, but not some ordinary, sane sort of a feminist. We were talking a slightly unhinged and controlling zealot and purist, and who with separatist leanings, and a very sort of powerful need to keep her life orderly, which a woman rather like. Yeah. To the next. Oh dear. No.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This is the trouble with having an elaborate PowerPoint.
It's okay.
That's all right. Okay. Have those media images again. Have them melt away. A woman rather like her. Here we are. This is actually Judith Butler. I'm a feminist professor. I thought, look, Judith, you're a good person. You can be Andrea today. A woman like this woman, which is Professor Andrea Rampion. Now, Professor Andrea Rampion is the head of women's studies. Note the spelling of women. Take the man out of women. She's a professor, head of women's studies at a prestige university, and her office is on the top floor of the tallest building on campus. All right, she's acrimoniously divorced and has one very beautiful daughter who rebels very strongly against her mother's feminist epiphany, which she has when she's 8 or 9 years old, and rebels by secretly skipping school, getting a friend to forge her mother's signature, and going to do fashion modelling from the age of 14 or 15. And being a rather sort of vulnerable young lady who feels a bit abandoned by her father, who's long since departed with one of his graduate students, I made him a professor of geography, falls pregnant to a married Finnish photographer at the age of 16. Now, naturally, as you would expect, Andrew is absolutely ropeable, is pushing her to have an abortion and trying to have him sued for sort of unlawful sexual conduct, but she refuses. She said, we are in love, I want to have this baby, and when I present him with his baby, he will leave his wife for me because I'm so young and beautiful. What would he want with his middle-aged wife? Surprisingly, this doesn't quite work out the way she hoped. So she ends up dumping the baby on Andrea and running away, leaving Andrea raising the baby. So this is how Andrea comes to be in custody of a young baby girl. And of course, this time, she's going to do it right. She blames what happened to her daughter going off the rails, on the evil patriarchal messages her daughter absorbed from the media, and this time she's going to make sure none of that stuff gets to her granddaughter, so she has a second chance at motherhood. All right then. So once we have had Andrea, the rest of the cast came out nicely. So we sort of start. So we have Rapunzel's mother is Emmeline Rampion. She was Emmeline, but when Andrea had her feminist epiphany, she renamed it Emmeline after the first suffragette. And he finished photographer, knocks her up. And who, of course, he steals Rampion, which is of course another name for Rapunzel, from Andrea, effectively. He steals her daughter from her, impregnates her. And so I don't actually have the herbs in any really concrete sense, but I do have it embedded in the surname, which is Rampion. And also I have it in the desire, both the desire of the photographer, who does appear in name, but I won't tell you because it gives some things away. The photographer and Emmeline for each other, and also Emmeline's desire to bear the Rampion. So so to speak, so that she can steal him from his wife. And there's Andrea being very worried and angry, and of course, so she takes custody of the child, who grows up to become Sage Rampion. Now, she gets a tizzy name from Emmeline, and so she renames her Sage as a more solid, feminine, sort of feminist herbal kind of a name, rather than a sort of tizzy, girly name like her dad chose. And she protects Sage very carefully from all sort of outside influences until the arrival of young Ryan Prince, who is a young sort of artist who's decided that making a career as an artist is really not generating enough cash, and has gone back to university to do a degree. Okay, so once I've established my cast, let's have a look back at how I was handling my key motifs. All right, so I've got my tower, the tower there. I actually ended up having two towers. So my first was the ivory tower. So obviously I've got a building in this is actually a genuine university building somewhere in the US. But I ended up having sort of done such a kind of hyper-real depiction of the sort of extreme radical feminist, so like unhinged feminist. I thought it's only fair to depict the evils of the opposite extreme. So eventually in the novel, Sage goes and tracks down her runaway mother, who is living in a luxury penthouse as the trophy girlfriend of a very wealthy man. And I actually based that penthouse on the Marriott in Exhibition Street in Melbourne, where a friend of mine, a wealthy friend of mine, actually had a penthouse apartment in the residential wing. Before that, I didn't actually realise that hotels have residential wings, but they do. All right, so I've got my tower covered. I talked about that, which I sort of covered the Rampion symbolically. The healing tears I won't tell you, because that's quite a long way into the plot, and that will give too much away. But it's worth going a little bit deeper into hair, because this is Rapunzel's kind of key iconic element after all. So let's look on here. So the hair factor. Let's have a bit of a look at the hair factor. Now, I didn't want Rapunzel to be just a girl who happened to have long blonde hair. Just like the tower happening to be a tall building, it kind of lacked a little symbolic potency, I found. So what we have in the original fairy tale is that her hair is the ladder by which outside influences can actually enter her world. And I've actually recaptured this, as you'll see in the excerpt, which I'm going to read in a couple of minutes. So I also found that introducing the feminist element actually gave me a huge range of links into the idea of women's sexuality and hair. So if we look at feminism and female body hair, now this is the very 1970s version of feminist, which is of course the sort of version of feminism which Andrea would have adopted herself, because she's in her early 60s when the story begins. So the idea that a radical feminist who was very devoted in the 1970s would cast out social restrictions about women should remove their armpit hair and all this sort of stuff, and would let it all grow free, which is a quite Rapunzel-esque kind of notion. The other thing is that women's hair length is also quite closely linked socially in our society to the idea of femininity. So when you have a little girl in the US, for example, sort of a celebrity's daughter shaves her head, they're all up in arms about, oh, she might turn into a lesbian because you cut her hair short, as if this is the most terrible thing that could happen to her. But also, it shows you there's another side to it, because not only is women's hair length linked to being beautiful and feminine, which is of course women's first beauty, there's also a link to sexuality. There's this idea if a woman has short hair, there's a link there too. She's got to be a feminist and probably a lesbian as well. So I sort of wanted to play with those things, and throughout the story you'll see Sage's hair being longer and shorter, representing whereabouts she's sitting with regard to the feminism she's inherited from her grandmother at the time. Finally, the other interesting thing in Rapunzel is we do actually see some of the sort of symbolic shaving of the fallen woman's head. And this is something we saw a lot when you saw women sort of who'd actually had affairs with German soldiers, especially if they'd born children. That people, this is sort of after, I think it was World War I. You had a lot of people sort of disgracing them because they had fallen, they'd sort of slept with the enemy, shaving their heads as punishment. So even though obviously this was a century beforehand, maybe that's sort of echoing back to that old form of punishment form, really by cutting off her beauty, so to speak. So I wanted to incorporate the hair factor, and I actually do use hair as a sort of barometer of where she is in the world, and as the means by which influences enter her world. Finally, let's have a bit of a look at how I sort of looked at the contemporary Australia thing. And some of this is a somewhat unfortunate reflection on the size of Australia in the English-speaking world and the marketing of books to these days. Now, if you read and lift down your hair yourself, you'll notice that it employs an awful lot of American English. They're all the way through, there are references to elevators, cell phones, and college, and other American things. Now, this wasn't in the original version. This was actually pushed on me by the publisher, who sort of pointed out to me something I have actually heard before, which is that if a novel is too Australian, that's commercial death. not if a novel is actually setting out to be, particularly Australian oriented with hawks and witches hats and so on, but if it's attempting to be a sort of a mainstream contemporary novel. So I had to go through and change all the references to lifts to elevators and change all the mobile phones to cell phones and so on. Now, however, if you are actually Australian and overlook these things, you can actually see that I'm grounded quite strongly in a contemporary Australian setting. I have actually kept the setting and country and city where the story occurs carefully non-specific, because I suspected this problem would come up. But if you look closely, it is drawing quite heavily on Melbourne. For example, the tower, here's an example of a sort of contemporary fairy tale interpretation. It says, smartphone on a stick, who has the fairest profile pic? Okay. So, with my tower, it's actually, I drew quite heavily on my own unfortunate period as a PhD student, which I did indeed complete my PhD in an office in the tallest building on campus of Melbourne University, which is, as you can see, the very picturesque 1960s architecture of the Redmond Barrier Building. And we did talk before about how I based the second tower on the Marriott on Exhibition Street. The other thing to look at is how I interpreted the wilderness. Now I actually have one fairly generic interpretation of the wilderness and one very Australian interpretation. The first one, I actually drew on a more contemporary idea of what it means to be wild, namely the red light district. So I have a few scenes in the red light district standing in as the wilderness, because it's the place where she's cast out. And of course, if your grandmother is a hardline radical feminist, and you were raised by her, where else you go when you rebel, what's likely to happen? All right, and eventually we do actually have the second idea of the wilderness, which is a sort of a soft leafy place with a sort of bell-like birds singing, and tree ferns, which don't really occur anywhere other than Australia. So that's actually based on the dandelions, as is the community that Sage eventually ends up living with. So having given you a bit of an overview of how I sort of encapsulated, let me now read you a little excerpt of Let Down Your Hair. It is an excerpt from the end of chapter 1. So I've cut bits out that don't make any sense if you haven't read the rest. So what's happened here, to give you an entry into the scene, Sage has turned up at university for the first day of her PhD, a day that some of you may recall with more or less fondness, depending on how it's going. Alright, so she, Andrea has of course wanted to keep tabs on her, as she does, has of course asked her to share her top floor office. Keep an eye on her, can't let her go astray. And she's just gone in, and she's sort of looking out the window. She says, as I lowered my backpack to the floor, something scarlet caught my eye. I went to the window and the sun came out, shining through a skylight in the roof of the building opposite. Under the skylight was a dark-haired young man, lying naked on a bright red rug. A flush spread over my face and neck, as if someone had doused me in hot water. I wasn't sure whether to bolt for the door or stand at the window and stare. The only naked men I'd seen were textbook illustrations when Andrea taught me biology. She was homeschooled, of course. Seeing a live one from her office was like biting into an apple and finding a snake. Yet there he was, head propped on one elbow, alien genitals at rest on a nest of curly hair. What was he doing there? Did he know people could see him through the skylight? Maybe he had no idea. Or maybe he did, and he was getting his kicks by flaunting his body at the head of women's studies. The thought of Andrea steadied him. Andrea always knew what to do about men, but she wasn't here and I couldn't call her. She hated mobile phones and kept hers switched off, except to check her voicemail once a day. Until she returned, I'd have to face the window alone. I backed into my chair and switched on my computer, clutching the mouse like a talisman to protect against male nudity. How would Andrea react? I dreaded her lessons on sex education. With numbers and letters, she was matter of fact. With bodies, she was forced and self-conscious. Sex is a natural part of life, she'd say, looking unnatural as she said it. To be enjoyed when you feel ready, alone or with someone you trust. She reinforced this sex-positive message by giving me a vibrator when I hit puberty. The one time I'd turned it on, the dentist drill buzz disturbed me so much that I hid it in my wardrobe and never touched it again. Keys jangled outside the door, and I jumped as if caught doing something forbidden. I grabbed the staff handbook and opened it at random as Andrea strode in. My grandmother was about a head shorter than me, but she always seemed taller. When she entered a room, a nervous hush fell as though she headed an invisible army. Her jaw was square and her hair was thick and iron grey, not only on her head, but on the inches of ankle emerging from her trousers. Hi, hun. She dumped a folder labelled Equity and Discrimination on her desk. I eyed her irritated face. Is something wrong? Faculty artist. University politics. Her voice was disgusted and cynical. Even more wrong than global politics. She glanced over my shoulder. Can you make it home by 6 tonight? I've got a community meeting at 7:30 and I need a haircut. Sure. Andrea refused to support the beauty industry. We wore recycled clothing, used homemade soap and cut each other's hair. Until I was 18, we had identical short haircuts with a part on the side. Then, after my first semester at university, I'd stopped having it cut altogether. Andrea hadn't been pleased. Long hair was an unnecessary vanity, a waste of resources, an inconvenience adopted for the enjoyment of men. I nodded repentantly, agreed that that was so, but kept on dodging the scissors. She wanted to know why, but I dodged that too, not daring to confess how I'd been shamed into growing my hair. Now it reached almost to my waist. I kept it coiled and covered with a crocheted brown hairnet, conscious of her disapproval. Actually, Andrea, I added in a shamefaced rush, there was something I wanted to tell you. She checked her watch. Well, make it quick. I have a meeting. It's just that there's a naked man down there through the skylight. A naked man! She marched over to the window and exhaled like a dragon breathing fire. Without breaking stride, she stomped back to her desk and stabbed a number into the phone. It rang and rang, muffled against her ear. Oh, for fuck's sake! She hung it up with a crash that made me jerk. I huddled in my desk chair. Who are you trying to ring? The buildings manager, whose boss I'll have words with at this meeting. She bent to give me an unexpected hug. I'm so sorry you had to see that, hun, especially on your first date. It's despicable. Will you be okay? I nodded, more intimidated than soothed by her fierce, steely arms. Don't worry, she said, added with a reassuring pat. You'll never see that naked man again. The door banged behind her as she left the office, and I slumped at my desk like a sandcastle hit by a wave. When her footsteps faded, I picked up the handbook again, biting my lip. PhD in Women's Studies. The words rang in my head like an ominous bell. How could I be starting one of those? PhDs were for serious, clever people who knew what they were doing, not pretenders who hadn't yet decided what they wanted to research, let alone found someone to supervise their project. I made myself open the handbook again and skimmed the staff profiles. When I reached Hilda Zieler, specialist in feminist art, something occurred to me. There were art studios along the top floor of the building below the window. The man I'd seen through the skylight wasn't exposing himself, he was posing for a life drawing class, and now I'd shocked into Andrea. I rushed back to the window. Through the skylight, the man was no longer naked. He was standing in a navy blue robe, talking to someone I couldn't see. Was he in a studio? On the top floors, stoppers had been installed to prevent the windows from opening too wide. I slid my head carefully through the gap, and the catch on the frame lodged in my bum. Trapped between frame and sill, I struggled to free myself, and the movement caught the man's attention. He looked up through the skylight, and our eyes met. The hairnet holding my bun came free, and my hair spilled out the window, rippling in the wind like a long, pale scarf made of silk.
This pixie cut is very new.